She was the sheriff's daughter. I was the town's bad habit. Welcome to the world of country romance. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The air at the Redemption Peak Town Fair was thick with the smells of fried dough, sawdust, and the sweet, earthy scent of livestock, a familiar perfume that did little to soothe the restless energy simmering under skin. He leaned against the rough-hewn rails of a holding pen, the cream-colored Stetson pulled low over his eyes, casting his face in shadow. Below the brim, his green eyes scanned the crowd not with interest, but with the ingrained vigilance of a man who knew he was being watched. He was here for one reason: to sell his prize-winning Charolais bull, a 2,000-pound mountain of muscle and genetics that represented a year's worth of hard work and a much-needed infusion of cash for his ranch. Business was the only thing that could drag him into this swirling vortex of forced pleasantries and judging eyes, a place where his reputation preceded him like a thunderclap. For 10 years, ever since the Miller barn fire, he had been Redemption Peak's bad habit, a piece of gossip chewed on and spat out by folks who needed a villain to make their own lives seem cleaner. He had long ago stopped trying to correct the narrative, finding a strange, bitter freedom in their condemnation. If they were going to see him as a storm cloud on the horizon, he might as well let them wonder when the lightning would strike. From across the rodeo grounds, standing in the sparse shade of the grandstand, Regina watched him. She knew the stories, of course. You couldn't grow up as the sheriff's daughter in a town this small without having the local folklore imprinted on you. Was the ghost story parents told their kids, the cautionary tale of a good family name tarnished by recklessness. Yet, what she saw didn't quite align with the town's caricature of a belligerent outcast. She saw a man moving with an economy of motion, a quiet confidence in how he handled his prize animal, and a stillness that seemed out of place amidst the fair's chaotic energy. He wasn't performing for anyone. He was simply existing, a self-contained island in a sea of pointing fingers and whispered assumptions. Her father, Sheriff, stood beside her, his posture as rigid as his worldview. He followed her gaze, and his mouth tightened into a familiar line of disapproval. "Best keep your distance from that one, Regina," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Trouble follows him like a shadow." Regina offered a noncommittal hum, her hazel eyes still fixed on. She'd been back in Redemption Peak for 6 months, trading her corporate job in agricultural business for the hands-on work of managing her father's sprawling property, and the town's simplistic, black-and-white view of the world was beginning to chafe. She saw shades of gray everywhere, and with his messy blonde hair and the unapologetic set of his shoulders, seemed to be a masterpiece painted in them. The afternoon sun beat down, and the lazy rhythm of the fair was abruptly shattered by a sharp crack, followed by a collective gasp from the crowd near the north pens. A heavy wooden rail, weakened by rot and the strain of leaning spectators, had splintered, giving way. A tide of young steers, spooked by the sudden noise and the opening, began to surge forward, their eyes wide with panic. The situation devolved into chaos instantly. Ranch hands shouted conflicting orders, men in shiny belt buckles waved their hats uselessly, and the crowd scrambled back, their excitement curdling into fear. Sheriff's voice cut through the din, barking commands into his radio, but he was coordinating a response, not providing one. Regina watched, her heart pounding, as the potential for a dangerous stampede became terrifyingly real. Then she saw movement. While everyone else was reacting to the noise, was already in motion, vaulting the fence into an adjacent pen with a fluid grace that belied his solid build. He didn't run or shout. He moved deliberately, angling himself to get ahead of the lead steer, his focus absolute. He used his hat not to spook the animal, but to gently guide its line of sight, turning the creature's momentum back towards the broken enclosure. It was a subtle, masterful display of livestock sense, an intimate understanding of herd instinct that couldn't be learned from a book. He was turning the entire group with the quiet pressure of his presence alone, and within a minute that felt like an hour, the immediate danger was over. The cattle, their panic subsiding, milled about in confusion as the ranch hands finally scrambled to create a makeshift barrier. Simply slipped back over the fence, retrieved his hat from the dust, and returned to his post as if nothing had happened. Her father's voice crackled over the radio, calm restored. He glanced over at the scene, shaking his head slightly. "Lucky for once," he muttered, dismissing the profound skill she had just witnessed as a fluke. But Regina knew better. What she had seen was competence, pure and simple. And it planted a seed of doubt in the hard-packed soil of her mind. A suspicion that the story the town told about was not just wrong, but a deliberate injustice. That seed had only a few days to germinate before the storm hit. It rolled in from the west, a bruised purple wall of clouds that swallowed the sun and unleashed a torrent of biblical proportions. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that turned the dusty roads into churning rivers of mud. Regina was in the main house, listening to the wind howl and the rain hammer against the roof, when the call came from one of her ranch hands, his voice strained with panic over the crackling line. A low-lying pasture near the creek had become a lake, and the flash flood had trapped a half-dozen of her father's most valuable horses against a. The water was rising fast, and the terrified animals were in danger of being swept away or injuring themselves in their frenzy. The county's emergency services were already stretched to their limit, and her own men were struggling to get a rope across the current. A cold knot of desperation tightened in her stomach. She thought of her father, miles away coordinating the town's response, and knew she was on her own. And then, unbidden, the image of a man in a cream-colored hat, moving with calm authority amidst chaos, flashed into her mind. It was a reckless idea, born of desperation, but it was the only one she had. Leaving her foreman in charge, she climbed into her truck and navigated the treacherous roads, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. Ranch was even more isolated than she remembered, tucked back in a small canyon the town had mostly forgotten. As she pulled into his muddy driveway, the headlights illuminated a scene of controlled struggle. He was on his own roof, a lone figure against the raging sky, wrestling a large blue tarp over a section where the wind had torn away shingles. He worked with a relentless, focused rhythm, seemingly oblivious to the gale that threatened to peel him off the roof. For a moment, she just sat there, the engine idling, watching him and feeling a fresh wave of doubt about her decision. This man was dealing with his own crisis. What right did she have to ask him to abandon it for hers? But the image of the trapped horses spurred her on. She killed the engine, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the storm. He saw her immediately, his movements ceasing as he watched her approach. She had to shout over the wind, "I need your help!" He remained on the roof, his expression unreadable in the gloom. "My father's horses are trapped in the floodwater off Miller's Creek. We can't get to them." He slowly, carefully made his way to the edge of the roof and climbed down the ladder, landing softly on the saturated ground. He stood before her, soaked to the bone, rain dripping from his thick beard, his green eyes boring into hers. He didn't ask why she came to him or what the sheriff's men were doing. He just looked at her, a long, calculating silence stretching between them. "All right," he said finally, his voice a low growl that was almost lost in the storm. "I'll help, but you'll owe me a favor. No questions asked, to be collected whenever I say." Regina didn't even hesitate. In his eyes, she saw not the opportunism of a scoundrel, but the stark transaction of a man who had learned not to give anything for free, especially to a town that had taken everything from him. "Deal," she said, the single word a pact sealed in the heart of the storm. What followed was in grit and instinct. They worked through the night, a two-person team against the fury of nature. His quiet commands cut through the wind and rain with more authority than the shouts of her entire crew. He knew how to read the current, how to rig a pulley system using his truck and a sturdy oak tree, how to approach the panicked animals without sending them into a further spiral of fear. He and Regina moved in a strange, unspoken rhythm, her knowledge of the horses and his raw, practical expertise meshing perfectly. She'd anticipate the need for a length of rope, and he would already be coiling it. He'd gesture toward a high point on the bank, and she would already be scrambling toward it. In the swirling chaos of water and wind, under the stark glare of truck headlights, they were not the sheriff's daughter and the town outcast. They were simply two capable people, fighting for the same goal, their shared resolve a tangible thing in the air between them. They were cold, muddy, and exhausted, but as they led the last shivering horse to safety on high ground, a profound and unexpected connection had been forged between them. For the first time, Regina saw the whole man, stripped of rumor and reputation, and found him to be more honorable than any of the so-called good men who had written him off. And she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that the favor she now owed him would change everything. The weeks that followed the storm passed with a deceptive tranquility, the valley slowly drying out under the persistent autumn sun. Yet for Regina, an invisible current of tension hummed just beneath the surface of her daily routines. The memory of that night, the roaring wind, the churning water, and the quiet, unwavering competence of the man beside her, refused to fade, replaying in her mind with a clarity that was both unsettling and strangely compelling. She would be mending a fence line or reviewing feed accounts, and the image of rain-slicked face, illuminated by the stark glare of the headlights, would rise unbidden. It wasn't just the physical reality of the favor she owed him that lingered, but the profound shift in her own perception. The carefully constructed caricature of the town's bad habit had been washed away by the flood, leaving behind the stark, compelling silhouette of a man she couldn't reconcile with the gossip she had been fed her entire life. She saw him once, from a distance, loading feed sacks into the back of his weathered pickup truck outside the co-op. Their eyes met across the dusty parking lot, a brief, charged moment of acknowledgement that felt more significant than an hour of conversation. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat, before turning back to his work without another glance. He wasn't pursuing the debt, and his patience only made it weigh more heavily on her, a silent, looming obligation that she carried with her everywhere. It felt less like a transaction waiting to be completed, and more like the first chapter of a story whose next page she was both desperate and terrified to turn. The call came on a Tuesday evening, just as twilight was bleeding purple and orange across the horizon. The phone buzzed against the polished wood of her father's old desk, and she answered with the distracted air of someone expecting a call about a hay delivery. The voice on the other end, however, was a low rumble that sent an immediate jolt through her system, a sound as raw and elemental as the storm in which they'd last spoken. "Regina," said, his name for her a simple statement, devoid of pleasantries. "It's time." Her breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the darkening fields. The quiet of the evening suddenly felt charged with significance. He didn't need to identify himself. He didn't waste words explaining his purpose. The unspoken understanding that had flowed between them in the chaos of the flood was still there, a direct line connecting them across the miles. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. "Not over the phone," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Meet me at my place, after dark. Come alone." The line went dead before she could respond, the abrupt silence leaving a host of unanswered questions swirling in the air. The secrecy of his request was a clear signal that this was not a simple favor. It was something that required the cover of night, something that couldn't be spoken of in the light of day. A flicker of fear danced with a spark of undeniable curiosity, a potent combination that had her grabbing her keys long before her rational mind had a chance to object. The drive to his ranch was even more unnerving this time, the familiar roads twisting into shadowy, unknown territory under the faint light of a crescent moon. His isolation, which had once seemed a simple consequence of his reputation, now felt like a deliberate strategy, a fortress built against a world he didn't trust. When she pulled up to the large barn, its silhouette a dark mountain against the star-dusted sky, he was waiting for her, leaning against the massive sliding door. He wasn't the soaked and struggling man from the storm, but a figure of immense stillness, the quiet master of his domain. He pushed the heavy door open, revealing an interior bathed in the warm, golden glow of a single hanging bulb. The air inside was thick with the rich, comforting sense of hay, leather, and dry earth, a stark contrast to the swirling anxieties in Regina's mind. He gestured for her to come inside and slid the door closed behind them, shutting out the rest of the world and encasing them in a bubble of conspiratorial silence. He didn't offer her a seat or engage in small talk. He walked to the center of the barn, his boots stirring up small motes of dust that danced in the light, and turned to face her, his green eyes intense and serious. "The favor," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "I don't want your money, and I don't need help with the ranch. I need something only the sheriff's daughter can get." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I want the sealed case file on the Miller barn fire, the one from 10 years ago. The request hit Regina with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. This was not a line being crossed. It was a leap into an abyss. The Miller barn fire was the foundational myth of his downfall, the event that had irrevocably branded him. It was a closed case, ruled an accident by her own father's department, a piece of settled history that no one dared to disturb. To retrieve that file would be a monumental breach of trust, a betrayal of her father, and a flagrant abuse of the access her family name afforded her. Her mind reeled, trying to process the audacity of his demand. "Why?" she managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. "What could possibly be in that file?" He took a step closer, and for the first time she saw past the stoic mask to the deep, ancient wound beneath. The hardness in his eyes was not malice, but a pain that had been calcifying for a decade. "Because it wasn't an accident," he said, his voice low and raw with conviction. "And I wasn't the reckless kid who almost burned down the valley. I was there that night, yes, but I was trying to get the horses out after the fire had already started. Someone else saw me there, saw an opportunity, and let the whole town believe I was the cause. My family lost everything because of that lie. Our name, our credit, our friends. I want that file because I know they buried something, and I'm done letting that lie define me." His story hung in the air between them, heavy and potent. It was a version of events so contrary to the town's official history that it felt like blasphemy to even consider it. Yet, looking at him, at the quiet dignity in his posture and the unyielding truth in his eyes, she believed him. The man who had methodically saved her father's horses from a raging flood was not a man capable of the careless destruction he'd been accused of. Her loyalty to her father, a pillar of her existence, was now at war with this powerful, gut-level instinct telling her that a great injustice had been done. To help would be to stand against her father, against the powerful Miller family, against the entire town. But to refuse felt like being complicit in the lie that had haunted him for a decade. He watched her internal struggle, his expression patient but unyielding. He had laid his truth at her feet, and the choice was now hers alone. She thought of her father's casual, dismissive "lucky" for once, at the fair, and the seed of doubt that had been planted then blossomed into a full-blown conviction. The town's narrative was flawed, and her father, for all his righteousness, was a part of it. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Regina met his intense gaze, her decision solidifying in her heart. "Okay," she said, the single word feeling like the most significant one she had ever spoken. "I'll get it for you." A flicker of something, surprise, relief, gratitude, passed through his eyes before the stoic mask slid back into place. He simply nodded. The deal was struck. They were no longer just the sheriff's daughter and the town's bad habit. They were partners, bound by a dangerous secret and the shared pursuit of a decade-old truth. The air in the barn was electric, the space between them charged with the gravity of their pact and an undeniable, magnetic pull that promised this was only the beginning. The act of betrayal felt cold and heavy in Regina's hands, taking the physical form of a small, brass key she had known about since she was a teenager. It was her father's emergency spare for the records room, tucked away in the back of his bottom desk drawer. A place of such mundane trust, she felt a wave of nausea just touching it. For 2 days after her pact with, she wrestled with a profound sense of disloyalty, the weight of her father's implicit faith in her pressing down like a physical burden. Every shared meal was a charade, every casual question about her day a small torment. Yet, beneath the guilt, a stubborn and unfamiliar resolve was hardening within her, forged in the memory of raw conviction and the flicker of justice she saw in his eyes. She chose a Thursday night, knowing her father would be at the monthly county supervisor's dinner an hour away, and the station would be manned by Deputy Miller, a young C-student of a lawman who was more interested in the glow of his smartphone than the security cameras. Walking into the sheriff's station, under the pretense of dropping off some paperwork for her father's ranch business, felt disarmingly normal, a testament to how easily access was granted to the sheriff's daughter. She made small talk with the deputy, a mind-numbing conversation about high school football, all the while her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a drum of deception. When he was sufficiently distracted by a video on his phone, she slipped into her father's office, the click of the closing door sounding like a gunshot in the quiet building. The air in the office was thick with the familiar sense of old paper, leather, and his subtle, woodsy aftershave, a combination that made her guilt twist into a sharp pang of sorrow. With trembling hands, she retrieved the key, her fingers tracing the intricate coat of arms of a department she was actively undermining. The records room was a small, windowless chamber in the back, a vault of town secrets and sordid sins. The lock turned with a well-oiled whisper, and she slipped inside, pulling the heavy door almost closed behind her. Under the cold, humming fluorescence, she found the section for closed cases, the cardboard boxes packed tightly on metal shelves, a library of past transgressions. Miller, Barn Fire, Case 74B, was written in her father's neat, decisive hand. The box was heavier than she expected, filled with the tangible weight of a decade-old lie. Tucking it under her arm, she slipped back out, returned the key to its hiding place, and walked out of the station with a polite wave to the oblivious deputy, her entire body screaming with the adrenaline of her trespass. The cool night air felt electric against her skin as she placed the box on the passenger seat of her truck, a Pandora's box whose contents could either liberate a man or destroy her entire world. The drive to Ranch was a journey deeper into conspiracy, each mile taking her further from the life she knew. The headlights of her truck cut a lonely path through the darkness, and with every turn, she felt the invisible threads connecting her to the town, to her father, stretching and fraying. When she arrived, the barn was once again their designated sanctuary, a single warm light glowing from within, a beacon in the vast, silent darkness. Was waiting just inside the door, and the moment he saw the box in her arms, his entire body seemed to coil with a tense, focused energy. He took it from her without a word, his fingers brushing against hers, a brief, static touch that sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the night's chill. He carried the box to a large, makeshift table he had cleared in the center of the barn and set it down with a reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. For a long moment, they just stood there, staring at the plain cardboard box that held so much power, the air thick with anticipation. The silence wasn't awkward. It was charged, filled with the unspoken gravity of what they were about to do. This was the point of no return. He finally looked at her, his green eyes searching her face in the dim light. "You sure about this, Regina?" he asked, his voice low, giving her one last chance to turn back. She simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. Her answer was in her presence, in the fact that she had crossed every line to bring this box to him. With a deep breath, he broke the seal. The contents smelled of time and neglect, a dry, dusty scent that filled the cavernous space of the barn. He carefully lifted out the file folders, their manila paper yellowed and brittle at the edges, and laid them on the table. It was all there, grainy blackened white photos of the fire's aftermath, the skeletal remains of the barn stark against the night sky, typed transcripts of witness interviews, their signatures faded, and a thick, detailed report from the fire marshal. They started with the photographs, spreading them out like a tarot reading of past events, pointed to one showing the main door of the barn, its frame blackened and charred. "They said I was trying to get in, but look," he said, his voice tight. "The fire started in the tack room on the west side. The main doors were on the east. I was at the horse stalls on the far side, trying to break the locks when the first engine arrived. I wasn't going in, I was letting them out." His words painted a picture so vividly different from the official narrative. They moved to the witness statements next. The key testimony was from Old Man Miller's ranch foreman, a man who claimed he saw running from the direction of the tack room just as the flames became visible. "He was a liar then, and he's a liar now," muttered, his hand clenching into a fist on the table. "He hated my father, said he'd find a way to run us out of the valley one day." Regina read the statement again, noticing the careful, almost coached phrasing, the lack of any real detail beyond the main accusation. It felt hollow, a story crafted to fit a predetermined conclusion. They worked for hours, the moon climbing high in the sky, their world shrinking to the pool of light on the table, the rustle of old paper and the low murmur of their voices. A strange intimacy grew between them, born of their shared purpose. They sat shoulder to shoulder, their arms occasionally brushing, a comfortable proximity that felt both natural and intensely charged. She was hyper-aware of him, of the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the quiet intensity that radiated from him, a stark contrast to the volatile troublemaker of town legend. Here, in this private space, he was just a man seeking a truth that had been stolen from him, and she was the only person in the world he trusted to help him find it. It was well past midnight when she found it. Tucked into the very back of the fire marshal's report was a supplemental page of handwritten notes, a log of the marshal's first day on the scene, evidently filed before the official, typed report was finalized. His handwriting was a barely legible scrawl, but one line jumped out at Regina as if it were written in fire. Initial assessment suggests accelerant used near tack room. Spoke with E. Miller Ray, insurance. He also mentioned a dispute with family over water rights. Must examine Miller's financial ledgers tomorrow. Something isn't adding up. Regina's blood ran cold. She read the line again, then a third time. She said, her voice hushed. "Look at this." He leaned over her, his head close to hers, his beard brushing her temple as he read the note. He was silent for a long moment, and then he straightened up, a look of dawning, ferocious understanding on his face. "The ledgers," he breathed. "I remember my father screaming at Miller about his investments a month before the fire. He said Miller was cooking the books." They immediately began to tear through the rest of the file, searching the official, typed report and the evidence logs. There was no mention of any financial ledgers. No record of them being examined, no record of them being taken into evidence, no record of them at all. The fire marshal's initial suspicion, his primary lead from the first day, had simply vanished from the official record. It was the crack they had been looking for, a gaping hole in the center of the investigation. The fire wasn't about a reckless kid or a petty feud. It was about destroying evidence. Just as this electrifying realization settled between them, the distant sound of a truck engine grew louder, slowing down on the main road that passed the edge of his property. A pair of headlights swept across the high windows of the barn, momentarily illuminating the dusty interior and throwing their startled faces into sharp relief. They both froze, their eyes wide, the sudden intrusion a violent reminder of the world outside their sanctuary and the danger of their search. The truck idled for a long, agonizing minute before the engine revved, and it pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the oppressive dark. The spell was broken. They were no longer just two people searching for the past. They were two people being watched, treading on ground that someone very powerful still considered worth protecting. Slowly slid the barn door shut and bolted it, the sound echoing with a grim finality. They looked at each other across the table, the scattered contents of the file a declaration of war between them. They had found their lead, but they had also announced their rebellion, and the silence of the night no longer felt safe. The week leading up to the Founders' Day dinner was in quiet dread, a suffocating blanket of tension that settled over Redemption Peak and seemed to emanate directly from the Miller family ranch. The drive by its barn had been a clear warning shot, a silent, menacing promise that their clandestine investigation had been noticed. The town's atmosphere shifted subtly, casual greetings felt strained, and the usual undercurrent of gossip was replaced with a watchful silence. Regina felt the change most acutely in her interactions with her father. He became distant, his conversations with her clipped and perfunctory, his eyes holding a new, troubled depth that she couldn't penetrate. He would ask her where she'd been, not with the casual interest of a parent, but with the pointed suspicion of a lawman who senses a conspiracy brewing under his own roof. Regina knew they were running out of time, that the fragile secrecy of their mission was fraying with each passing day. They needed more than the fire marshal's cryptic note. They needed proof, something tangible to corroborate their theory about the destroyed ledgers. Their only hope was the fire marshal himself, a man named Henderson who had retired 2 states away, a ghost from a past others had worked hard to bury. Made the call, his voice a low, steady instrument of persuasion, and to their astonishment, the old marshal agreed to talk, his voice weary with a guilt he had carried for a decade. He confessed over the phone that he had been pressured by then-deputy and a very influential Miller to close the case, to accept the simple narrative of a teenage troublemaker over the complex, damning truth of financial ruin and arson. He had kept his original, handwritten notes, a small act of defiance that now, years later, could become the key to unlocking the entire conspiracy. He agreed to send a sworn affidavit detailing the cover-up, and a scanned copy of the ledger page he had photographed before it disappeared from the evidence box. The package was their only card left to play, a single bullet in a high-stakes game they intended to play at the Founders' Day dinner, the one night the entire town, including its most powerful and corrupt figures, would be gathered in one place. The night before the dinner, the affidavit arrived. In the sanctuary of Sparn, they read the old fire marshal's sworn statement, each word a vindication and a condemnation. It detailed the pressure from a young sheriff and the outright threats from Old Man Miller, confirming every suspicion they had. It was the truth, cold and hard and undeniable. With the evidence now in their possession, Regina knew she could no longer avoid the confrontation she had been dreading. She drove home, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest, and found her father sitting alone in his study, staring into a glass of amber liquid. She placed a copy of the affidavit on the desk in front of him, the paper a stark white against the dark wood. He didn't need to read it. He simply stared at it, his shoulders slumping in a long-awaited defeat. The silence in the room was immense, filled with the weight of 10 years of lies. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, stripped of his usual authority. He confessed everything: the pressure from Miller, the fear of economic collapse if the town's biggest investor was exposed as a crook, the terrible, pragmatic decision to sacrifice one young man's reputation for what he had convinced himself was the greater good. He had chosen the town over justice, and the choice had slowly eroded his soul for a decade. Regina listened, not with the fiery anger she had expected to feel, but with a profound, aching sadness for the good man he was supposed to be, the man who had gotten lost somewhere along the way. There were no tears, only the quiet devastation of a daughter seeing her father's flawed humanity in its entirety for the very first time. "You have one chance to make this right, Dad," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Tomorrow night, you can either continue to be the man who buried the truth, or you can become the man who finally unearths it. The choice is yours." She left him there with the affidavit and his ghosts, knowing that the fate of their family and of his future now rested on the conscience of a broken man. The Founders' Day dinner was the shimmering apex of Redemption Peak's social calendar, held in the historic town hall, a place of polished wood floors and portraits of stern-faced pioneers. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roast beef, a facade of civility and prosperity that suddenly felt suffocating to Regina. She sat at a table with a deliberate act of solidarity that drew stares and whispers from every corner of the room. Dressed in a clean, dark shirt and his best jeans, looked neither intimidated nor defiant. He simply looked patient, a man waiting for a debt to be paid. The main event of the evening was an award for community leadership, and this year's recipient was, with sickening irony, Miller. As Miller, a man whose arrogance had been burnished by decades of unchecked power, walked to the podium to a round of polite applause, stood up. A hush fell over the room. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He simply walked to the front of the room, his movements calm and deliberate, and stood beside the podium. "Before Mr. Miller accepts this award," said, his voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the hall, "there's a piece of history this town seems to have forgotten." He held up a copy of the affidavit. "This is a sworn statement from Fire Marshal Henderson, the man who investigated the barn fire 10 years ago. It states that the fire was arson, designed to destroy financial records proving that Mr. Miller here was embezzling money from half the families in this valley, including my own." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Miller's face went from ruddy to a pale, mottled white, his son rising from his seat with a furious denial on his lips. But before anyone could speak, the main doors of the hall opened, and Sheriff walked slowly and deliberately to the podium. He looked not at Miller, but at the faces of the townspeople he had sworn to protect, his eyes finally landing on his daughter. "He's telling the truth," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with the weight of his confession. "I was a young deputy, and I helped Mr. Miller cover it up. I buried the evidence because I was told it would protect the town. But I was wrong. All it protected was a criminal, and all it did was destroy an innocent man's life." He looked at then, a look of profound, public apology. "As of this moment, the case is officially reopened." The confession shattered the carefully constructed reality of Redemption Peak. In the ensuing chaos, the Miller family's empire of lies crumbled into dust. In the months that followed, the town slowly began to heal, the truth acting as a painful but necessary antiseptic. His name was not just cleared, it was redeemed, his story becoming a new kind of local legend, one of resilience and unyielding integrity. Sheriff resigned, but his public confession, a final act of courage, began the long, slow process of mending the broken trust with his daughter and earning a measure of quiet respect from the community he had both failed and saved. The cloud that had hung over for a decade finally dissipated, leaving behind the bright, open sky of a future he was no longer afraid to claim. That future was sitting beside him on the porch of his ranch, which was now their ranch, its fences repaired and its fields thriving. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. Regina leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting comfortably in his, their fingers intertwined. They had spent the past few months not just rebuilding a ranch, but building a life, their shared ordeal having forged a bond that was stronger than steel. The quiet between them was no longer filled with tension or unspoken secrets, but with a deep and abiding peace, the comfortable silence of two people who have found their home in each other. "You know," Regina said softly, looking out at the horizon, "the whole town's talking." Smiled, a real, easy smile that reached his green eyes. "Are they now? And what are they saying about their favorite bad habit?" She turned to look at him, her hazel eyes soft and full of a love that was as steady and true as the mountains surrounding them. "They're saying," she whispered, "that the sheriff's daughter has exceptionally good taste." He laughed, a warm, genuine sound that echoed in the quiet air, and leaned in to kiss her, a kiss that tasted of second chances and hard-won happiness. The sun dipped below the peaks, and under the twilight sky, the town's bad habit and the sheriff's daughter looked out at their future, a future they had fought for, a future they would build together, their love the new, unshakable foundation of Redemption Peak.